Really quick, if you haven't seen my most recent episode on Maeve Insidious Singer, make sure you check that episode out at some time, because this Siren, well, it's a very interesting and unique commander that I think a lot of players are going to be really excited about. But do not leave just yet, because on this episode, we've got yet another exciting commander coming out in the Game Night product in October. And like the other previews that we've seen so far for these commanders, well, the image is a little grainy, so here is my custom version of the card. Thank you, MTG.design, for that. Anyways, Vogar Necropolis Tyrant is a 4/4 zombie giant with menace that costs 3 black. It has, whenever another creature dies during your turn, put a +1 counter on Vogar. And when Vogar dies, draw a card for each counter on it. So a few things to keep in mind here with the way that this is written. Number 1, this counts when any creature dies. It does not have to be one of your own, it can be any creature on the board. And with it being any creature on the board, this also does not specify non-token, which obviously can be huge and make a massive impact because, yeah, there are plenty of ways to make a ton of tokens, especially, ways that involve creatures dying and making you more tokens, so you've got ways to benefit even more from that. Now, obviously, a very important thing to keep in mind, though, is that this specifies only on your turn when creatures die. If creatures die in any other turn, it doesn't matter whose creatures those are, this does not get a counter. That being said, of course, there are plenty of ways to make sure that a ton of creatures die on your turn, whether they're your creatures or not, or both. Yeah, there are plenty of ways to do so to make this thing absolutely massive, get a ton of counters on it, and then maybe, have it die itself so you can get a ton of cards. On top of that, of course, there are plenty of other ways to get counters on this outside of its own triggers, so of course we're going to be talking about some cards that can help us with that. And with those cards, make sure, if you're interested in this commander, to check out the link in the description below that has the list of the cards I'm talking about on this episode. Because when a new exciting commander like this one is spoiled, even though it's pretty far out from when the actual commander is going to be coming out, well, some cards that work very well with it might go up in price. But now with all that said, let's jump into the cards. First up, of course, we've got a ton of ways to demolish a lot of creatures on our turn with cards like Plaguecrafter, Barter in Blood, and In Garruk's Wake. Plaguecrafter has, when it enters the battlefield, each player sacrifices a creature or planeswalker, each player who can't discards a card. So this is a massive downside for all of our opponents, essentially, no matter what. When this comes into play, I mean, obviously, if we really want to, we can sacrifice Plaguecrafter to itself, so that's great. And then our opponents each have to sacrifice one thing. If they don't, they discard a card, and most of the time, they are going to have a creature to sacrifice. So essentially, for 3 mana, we get rid of 3 of our opponent's creatures, and we get 4 counters in total on our commander. Which obviously translates into 4 cards drawn when our commander does die, so yeah, I mean, essentially, our edict effects like this can basically just be, hey, draw cards. 3 mana, draw 4, get rid of creatures, what's not to love? And speaking of that, how about Barter in Blood? For 4 mana, we make each player sacrifice 2 creatures. Now, we'll get to it here in a bit, but of course, we've got plenty of ways to make a ton of creature fodder so we don't sacrifice our commander, unless we actually, want to at a certain point to actually draw some cards. But yeah, this is basically 4 mana, get rid of 8 creatures in total, get 8 counters on our commander, which eventually becomes draw 8. The amount of card draw that this commander can produce once you get going and set up can be pretty amazing. And of course, a card like In Garruk's Wake can work incredibly with this commander. Just draw creatures you don't control and all planeswalkers you don't control. So our stuff stays safe, our opponent's stuff is gone, which just leaves them wide open for us to swing through, and we get an absurd amount of counters on our commander. I mean, this can very easily turn our commander into a one-shot KO in the right scenario. On top of just setting ourselves up to draw an incredible amount of cards at once. Moving on though, now let's talk about that creature fodder I talked about earlier with cards like Dreadhorde Invasion, Open the Graves, and Ogre Slumlord. Dreadhorde Invasion says at the beginning of your upkeep you lose 1 life and amass 1, which means we get a zombie army. Or I guess I should say if we already have a zombie army, then it gets slightly larger, but yeah, the vast majority of the time, we're going to have ways to sacrifice those zombie army tokens so that we can keep getting more and more counters on our commander. Next up, Open the Grave says, whenever a non-token creature you control dies, create a 2/2 black zombie creature token. Essentially, this can just give us double value out of any of our non-token creatures, and at the very least, that's just going to be an extra counter on our commander when that non-token creature dies, then we get the token, and then that dies. And speaking of value, my goodness, Ogre Slumlord can give us a ton with this commander. It says, whenever another non-token creature dies, you may create a 1/1 black rat creature token, and rats you control have Death Touch. So again, like our commander, this does not specify that it has to be our creatures dying. This counts anyone's non-token creatures dying. So this can make us a ton of tokens in absolutely no time. Again, at the very least, it essentially doubles up the amount of counters that we're going to be getting from non-token creatures dying. And of course, having a bunch of rats with Death Touch is never a bad thing. Next up though, and you can blame Eddie for me bringing this one up, but yeah, Eddie brought up the Gravecrawler Phyrexian Altar combo. Works very well with this commander. Gravecrawler is a 2/1 zombie that costs a black that can't block, and it says you may cast Gravecrawler from your graveyard as long as you control a zombie. Phyrexian Altar is an artifact that costs 3 and says sacrifice a creature at 1 mana of any color. So keep in mind our commander is a zombie. Because of that, we can keep recasting Gravecrawler from our graveyard, so we just sacrifice it to the altar to get a black mana, then we use that mana to recast Gravecrawler, then we sacrifice it again, and again, and again, and we keep looping. And of course, we can do this as many times as we want to get a certain number of counters on our commander that we want, and then yeah. We can then, of course, swing away with our massive commander, which has Menace, so if our opponents can't block it, they are gone, and yeah, we can also just sacrifice it and draw an absurd amount of cards, of course. So again, blame Eddie for bringing up this combo. Somewhat along those lines, though, other things that you are going to want to consider are sacrifice outlets like Viscera Seer. It says sacrifice a creature, scry 1. And while scrying isn't card advantage, it is fantastic card selection. Having a free sacrifice outlet like this one can be crucial in a lot of situations with a commander like this. Being able to sacrifice our fodder on demand to get more and more counters on our commander can be huge. And of course, along those same lines, being able to sacrifice our commander on demand is very important. For example, we might get a ton of counters on our commander, but if we've got no way to get rid of it when we want to, we can't just draw those cards when we might need them. And if an opponent either bounces it with a simple bounce spell, or they exile with something like Path to Exile, we're out of luck. All that work to get all those counters on it is just undone. Next up, reassembling Skeleton and other pieces of fodder like this one that can actually bring themselves back are huge as well. Pay 1 to black, return from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. With this commander in a somewhat roundabout way, it's kind of like pay 2 mana, draw a card. Other kinds of cards that you're going to want to consider, though, are ones that actually bring creatures right back with Feign Death. It says, until end of turn, target creature gains. When this creature dies, return to the battlefield, tap and resolve control a +1 counter on it. So we might have some creatures that have some ETBs, like a Plague Crafter, which we can use and abuse with something like this, or, you know, obviously also just another way to get our commander back right away and to get a counter on it, so that when we sacrifice it to draw those cards, we don't have to pay that commander tax to get it back. And yeah, we are actually getting a lot of these effects lately, so definitely a lot of great ones to consider. Moving on, another thing to consider is what to do with all those cards that you're drawing into. I mean, we can talk about some fantastic discard outlets with cards like Scourge Familiar and Zombie Infestation. Scourge Familiar has discard a card, add black. So yeah, that can be an absolutely incredibly powerful card. Essentially, hey, we just drew 20 cards or whatnot from our commander dying. Now we can utilize some of those cards for mana to cast even more things. Once things really get going with something like this can be very hard to stop. And of course, we can also turn the cards into our hand into creatures themselves with a card like Zombie Infestation. It says discard 2 cards, create a 2/2 black zombie creature token. Which again, when we're set up properly, it's kind of a roundabout way of saying, hey, discard 2 cards, draw 1. Yeah, I can see this commander having some pretty massive, incredibly powerful turns. Next up, of course, this commander can work very well with other ways to get counters on it, with a card like Blade of the Bloodchief being especially effective. It's an equipment that says whenever a creature dies, put a +1 counter on an equipped creature, and the equipped creature is a vampire, put 2 on instead. Now, unfortunately, our commander is not a vampire, but basically, this just doubles up our commander's trigger just on its own. So now when any creature dies, that essentially translates to draw 2 cards. Next up, a really cool card with this commander, but also a potentially risky one, is Unspeakable Symbol. It says pay 3 life, put a +1 counter on target creature, which again essentially translates into pay 3 life, draw a card. So in a very different way, it's kind of like a build your own worse Necropotence, but still very effective, and also a way that we can actually get a ton of counters on our commander in a burst if we need to either, you know, maybe finish off an opponent with commander damage, or again, just to set ourselves up to draw a lot of cards. And speaking of our commander hitting players, because again, it does have Menace, and of course there are plenty of other ways to help it get damage through. Regardless, Necropolis Tyrant can work great with it. It says whenever a creature you control deals counter damage to a player, put that many +1 counters on it. This essentially doubles up our commander's power when it hits, and again, it gets even more counters on it than it already had. And finally, one last thing to consider, obviously you can finish your opponents off with something like commander damage, but you can also finish them off in a big flashy way with something like Psychosis Crawler. Psychosis Crawler's power and toughness are each equal to the number of cards in your hand, which is nice because of course it can become very large, but also the more important thing is, whenever you draw a card, each opponent loses 1 life. Again, it can be quite easy to get a ton of counters on your commander very quickly, and by having a way to sacrifice your commander with either an edict effect or a free sacrifice outlet, you can just say, alright, my commander's big enough now, I'll just sacrifice it, draw an absurd amount of cards, drain my opponents for a ton, and probably drain them out with that. And of course, this is just only one of the ways that you can actually benefit from drawing a ton of cards, and yeah, there's other ways to benefit from discarding too. This commander's got a lot of potential with a lot of exciting cards out there. At the end of the day, yeah, I think there are going to be a lot of players out there that are excited about this new commander. This commander can get a ton of counters on it very quickly and very easily, and again, the benefit for doing so is not only being able to just smack your opponents with a giant menace commander, but also to draw an absurd amount of cards, and of course there's ways to benefit from all those cards that you are going to be drawing, or discarding, etc, etc. Yeah, this commander's got a ton of potential, and again, if you're interested in it, make sure you check out that link in the description below. And with that, the show is coming to a close, so it's my turn to hear from you. So in the comments below, let me know what your thoughts on this episode are, and as always, thanks again and have a good one. This show and episodes like this one are possible thanks to viewers like you. If you're looking for an easy way to help support this show, make sure that you like, share, and subscribe. Also, hit that bell notification icon so you don't miss any new episodes. You can also go check out our playmats and other merchandise at thecommandersquarters.com. We also have a ton of brand new t-shirt designs in stock, so make sure you check out those as well. Another easy way to support this show is with our TCG Player affiliate links. So whether you're buying a deck or individual cards, you can use this general link right here or one in the description. And the final way that you can support this show is by supporting us directly by becoming a patron. There are many benefits to being a patron, and I truly couldn't do this without all of their support.